I have the absolute privilege and honour now to be chairing a panel with the authors of this fantastic book. So would you join me in welcoming to the stage, please, Tony Moore, who was once my PhD supervisor and I let him down badly, Mark Gibson, Chris McAuliffe and Maura Edmond. Thanks. Tony, I'm going to start with you. So take us through the main argument of Fringe to Famous. It's really about the fringe and the mainstream of arts practice, and the phrase that you use in your argument is really interesting. So what do you mean by negotiated hybridity?
By negotiated hybridity, I think I got to take it out of the Latin or Greek derivatives and use the language that the artists used. So when we spoke to when we looked at the movement from a fringe practice into, say, working at the ABC, Andrew Denton described it, his role as the producer of The Chaser, as dealing with non-consequential and inessential dickheads. So just getting to Peter's
alive in
point,
politics, isn't it?
Just getting to Peter's point, we don't argue that we oppose a romantic notion that sees a movement from fringe to popular practice, to popular culture, as selling out. And particularly in music, that's a common accusation. Dave Faulkner from the Hoodoo Gurus saw them becoming popular as being egalitarian, as being democratic. And most of all of the authors and comedians, musicians, game people we spoke to, designers, their argument was they wanted more people to see their work and they wanted to impact the mainstream. But they didn't say it was easy. Yeah. And so we get back to what Peter said about the conflict that's involved in dealing with that particular large multinational. Peter negotiated, or Midnight Oil negotiated, a pretty amazing degree of autonomy. And there's been a lot of scholars have looked at that negotiation, and we've picked up on that work and I guess rolled it out over 80 interviews, 80 different artists that we spoke to from the 1980s through to the present who've had practice. Steve Vizard described the fringe community of Melbourne Uni Review, of all the small venue places in Melbourne, the community that had been built in the 1970s, a lot by the countercultures of that period, and then infested with punks and anarchic comedians as a kind of ecosystem of the fringe. But they then also worked in theatre restaurants where people from the suburbs came. And out of that, they developed the capacity to talk to larger audiences, which they thought was good. He took it into the heart of Channel 7, which he described as total warfare. But also, there were good people there, people we call animateurs in the book, but cultural entrepreneurs is a word that some people use. One of the interviewees, Marcus Westbury, said, when I hear the word entrepreneur, I want to punch someone in the face. But Steve used the phrase total warfare. But he also said, in fact, it was a negotiation and about what will work to bring in audiences and not scare them off, but also subvert. And he wanted to subvert media itself. But we spoke to many people about this process of negotiation. What we've really trying to do with the book is there's been this opposition between two abstracts, an abstract version of a romantic idea of the artist and it's a sellout, or the creative industries argument that economics predominate. We say that both economic value and cultural value are enhanced if their differences are respected and the balance is right.
That's a really great segue to my next question, actually, which is for Mark, because the subtitle of the book is After the Creative Industries, and that's obviously been a phrase or a policy framework that's had quite a lot of ascendancy in this century, and particularly under Labor governments. And so what yourself and your fellow authors of the books, what's the problem with the concept of creative industries and what are the alternatives we might explore?
Well, thanks, Emma. I mean, creative industry has been one of the big reforming ideas in cultural policy thinking of the last 20 years or so. It's been there's a lot of great stuff associated with it. I'll just make the point that what we've subtitled the book is After the Creative Industries, not Against the Creative Industries. So we want to kind of engage with the positive contributions that have been made around under the title of the cultural industries, particularly in relation to finding economies that support the arts. That's been, I think, one of the ideas that has driven this whole thing. But we also do want to take our distance from it, and we think that as a reforming idea, it's also kind of run out of juice. It's at an end, and there's a lot of legacy there. And we have in Victoria, Creative Victoria. There's many agencies and bodies around that have been moulded and formed by the creative industries. But as a kind of reforming energy, it's sort of come to the end, and so we're interested in what comes after it. And I think one of the other things to say about where we are in creative industries is that the hope was that it would save the arts, that if you could make the economic argument, if you could show that the arts were an industry and created jobs, you would end up with a better situation for artists. And as Peter said, the situation in many areas is quite grim, and I think that needs to be recognised. So in its own terms, there are questions that can be asked about how successful, or where we need to go now. And I think the core of the argument really is to recognise, as Tony's just said, that culture and economy are not the same thing. Cultural value, economic value are not the same thing. They can relate in productive ways and produce great outcomes. They don't always do so. There's a lot of problems and tensions and frictions involved. And I think a key part of the creative industries, or the problem that we see a lot of creative industries arguments, is that it minimised those differences. It tended to deny any difference between cultural value and economic value, and that's really problematic. So we wanted to get back to those ideas and tell stories from our interviewees in the different artistic fields that we look at, of the tension and the difference, but also the productive hybridisation and relation between them.
The hybridity requires difference. Two different things coming together.
I think the book does that really well, highlighting just the intrinsic cultural value in and of itself. And that, Maura, I want to bring you in here, because when we do think about fringe artists, countercultural artists, we tend to think about, hippies, people in the student union movement and so on. But this book also focuses on Indigenous filmmakers. And of course they emerged from one of the most marginalised creative communities in the world, let alone in the country. So why does the book look at First Nations filmmaking as a case study? And what do you think were the long-term DIY cultural politics and supports that enabled this community to make a mainstream impact over the last decade or so?
Yes. All right. So there are probably a lot of different ways that we could have approached talking about film, and funny little scenes and moments in Australian film history where things do cross over. There's quite a few interesting examples, and we played around with some of them. Some of them, like Ausploitation and stuff like that, had already had a reasonable amount of airtime. And at the time that we were writing, it was, the biggest success story, the impossible to ignore success story was Indigenous filmmaking and screenmaking. And what I was so drawn to about it, and what I continue to be so excited about, is that for me it is a kind of rebuttal against a sort of policy nihilism that creeps in around some of this stuff, where you can feel like nothing ever changes. We've had this same conversation so many times, things are so repetitive, same as it ever was. And that can just be such a grind. And in stuff that other people in the room might know of mine better, I talk a lot about those flaws and the inability to move the dial, and how tedious and, enervating that can be. And this is an exception to that. And it was this really beautiful demonstration that policy with vision, that's driven by principally activists who move into policy spaces, or creatives who move into policy spaces, that, a sort of a real vision a commitment and long-term commitment, right? This isn't a kind of quick fix, achieves remarkable things. And, you know, whenever I feel ground down by not being able to move the dial on the things that matter, this is a really, I know it's like, it's a success story, it's a policy success story. And it continues to be, even, you know, we started writing this and it continues to get ever more successful. It's kind of quite incredible, yeah.
Thank you. It's an important part of the book, I think. And while we are talking about case studies, Chris, I want to ask you, and Tony gave me this wording, so I'll try not to mangle it. What's the countercultural DNA of a surfwear label like Mambo? And what did it mean? How did it scale up? I mean, it's something that became a huge part of Australian culture, right, in the 80s and 90s. How did it do that?
It's a DNA that hasn't actually been mapped the way human DNAs. But I mean, one of the things that fascinated me was actually the long narratives in this underground mainstream dyad. And you know, I looked at Mambo as a streetwear success story of the mid-80s. You know, continues now, but the heyday was probably attained when Mambo, Reg Mombassa, designed the outfits for the Australian Olympic team for the 2000 Olympics. I mean, it doesn't get more mainstream than that. And may I say, Vale Ignatius Jones, who passed away this week, and moving from a shock rock theatricalised punk band to the designer of the fanfare and carnival of the Sydney Olympics in 2000 is exactly a form of negotiated hybridity. The rat bag, if I can borrow your word, the pungent iconography of Mambo and Ignatius Jones's carnival is exactly that hybridity, because people loved it. They loved being naughty Australians, you know, at that point. But the DNA, look, there's that, you know, if you look at the surf world, there's all of the trappings of a bohemian lifestyle, nomadism, utopian collectivity, death to the work, the time work discipline. I mean, it really looks like a classic sort of dropout counterculture. And yet it morphs into micro-capitalism with the birth of streetwear and surf brands. Dare Jennings picks up on that in the classic sort of backyard screen printing process. DNA literally, I think his sister was Kate Jennings, poet, feminist, anti-war activist, who incidentally married one of the lead designers for the Columbia record label in the US. I can't help thinking that it must have been something around their kitchen table that was about the DNA. But I guess the significant local hybridities were the real significance of the political street poster movement in Australia in the 70s, Jill posters, redback graphics, tin sheds, which are all through Mambo's design. And I think also the Ausploitation humour, like the rat bag, Barry McKenzie, Barry Humphries humour. So the DNA, and it goes to the point made at the opening, the DNA is kind of market savvy, antenna up on youth subculture, design conscious, ready to use local languages, but also above all for Mambo, ready to let their individual designers maintain their autonomy. The designers just brought the designs to Dare and he chose them. There was no brief. And keeping a lid on the culture as capital. He never ran a chain of stores. He never overextended it as a business in a way that would rebound on the artists. So it's quite a remarkable achievement to shift away from bohemia to a global market and still keep artistic autonomy, not just as a value, but as the brand. You know, I think that's the genius of that.
And that really goes to the broader point, Chris or Tony, either of you, on this really, particularly when it comes to alternative music, independent music, and how the scene for that's changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years, I'm getting old. Tony, why don't you start? Because this is, I think, a core part of the book, with the 80s, early 90s post-punk scene, and why you explicitly, and I think importantly, reject the criticism of artists who go to the mainstream or achieve, popular success as selling out.
Well, if you look at that scene, it was both a critique of the previous counterculture a little bit, anti-hippie, but really it had a continuity with it, and it was just its last great, well, one of its great moments was to be an art movement and not just music. So punk spanned design, the tin sheds, fashion, fanzines, filmmaking, and influenced comedians. So we kind of look at that. In part, I had done a book called Dancing with Empty Pockets about bohemianism from the 1860s, and I noted the movement from the beginning into popular culture in Australia through various things. An economy within the market of limited production, as Pierre Bourdieu calls it, that is independent record stores, independent record labels, the people making zines. The public infrastructure, university student unions that were mentioned before, the art schools where you could borrow a video camera, where you could get the DIY tools long before the internet was providing those. So we became interested in this whole ecosystem where a venue could be bands one day, comedians the next. The Sydney Trade Union Club had 3 floors. You could have a bit on each level like a layer cake. And out of that, we actually did the hard yards of mapping where people played and where people appeared on television. And I know Midnight Oil kept a wide berth from Countdown, and I think that was a smart move probably. But other bands like our good friends Mental as Anything or The Saints, or they were all there, a lot more than the standard narrative says. Then there was a whole bunch of shows, Edge of the Wedge, Rock Arena, Night Moves, where Peter Garrett used to have an ad, which scared me when I was 18. That was black and white and squeezed between the Talking Tables, Izzy Die ads. But I thought, what kind of band does an ad like that? And it was so rough and ready. So already there's this ambition, and it was these... we became interested in how punk actually did percolate in Australia through mainstream Channel 7, ABC, and the role of music video very early, long before MTV. But getting back to the counterculture, we see it as a kind of crucible of experimentation, risk-taking, bringing in different diversities. And it doesn't have to be Anglo kids hanging out in Newtown. It can be the Indigenous margins. It can be what young Asian people were doing in Box Hill, and so we're looking at it in terms of we define what it is. It's not just the good times we remembered as kids. We go right through to young people doing it today in Sydney. They still use the word punk, but it's completely different. But it's about an ethic, about a sensible relationship. And they would say they do all the digital, but they press vinyl and they want bodies together in places, like they want it to be social. So I guess we focused on moving it, how it moves through. And I guess a big heroes for us are the behind the scenes people. And some of them are here with us tonight, who are those animateurs within the ABC, within SBS Independent, within who move into the big record industries, who come from that fringe practice.
We could continue. Chris, did you want to add to
I just very quickly add, Tony's right. I mean, when we were interviewing bands, tools, the new digital tools were critical. And training, to return to the number of people we talked to who had powerful links, not just to music industries degrees, but to organisations like The Push, and they were learning how to survive and prosper. But I think the one where Tony and I differed a little is coming from an art background. I was stunned to hear a lot of musicians say that they wanted to be like artists, which I thought was hilarious because I knew how little money artists make. But they understood visual artists' longevity. You're still making when you're 80. You don't ever retire. But they also understood art as project by project. And also above all, side projects, collaborations, communities of practice. And I think that sense that the making was now mobile, redefinable, manageable, with a degree of autonomy that they hadn't had before. I think that just changed their perspective of what sustainable, healthy, creative practice looked like. And I think that was a very different thing.
So that sort of brings me to, I think it'll have to be our final point of discussion before we move on to the next panel. And I might start with Maura here, because I know you did your PhD on streaming. So the internet, social media, streaming platforms, direct-to-consumer platforms, a game changer, right, for alternative artists, alternative comedians, musicians, filmmakers, because it allows them to cut out the gatekeeper. But, and this is the big but, is the algorithm just the new gatekeeper? And how then does that platform-based work, does it still mediate what's available, and is it even more precarious for artists today operating over those platforms?
I thought we were
Small
trying to wrap
question.
this up.
Start at page 1 of your PhD.
All right, so thinking, just jumping from what Chris said there before about the musicians now modelling themselves on artists. So, you kind of, when I'm feeling utopian and I am listening to my favourite EPs by local musicians who now live in Castlemaine because they can't afford Melbourne, or who live in the Dandenongs because they can't afford Melbourne, and they are nonetheless my age. They have kids, that's why they live where they live, so that they can keep making music into their 30s and 40s without, needing to sell a lot of records. And they're able to maintain what is a beautiful life, which is an artist's life, and I think it's really nice. And they are able to maintain a kind of global network of kind of droney, low-key, underground, weird EP musicians. They go out on Boomcat and other weird, droney, low-key, independent record labels who are more or less kind of immaterial. Like they, one is based, it doesn't really matter where they're based, in fact, and on those labels there will be artists of similar types from all different countries, and I know they will be able to, courtesy of those global networks that are available through these digital networks and platforms, be able to do things like go on tour, and they'll have a bed to crash in Lisbon and a bed to crash in Copenhagen, and they will be able to have a kind of subsidised, beautiful artist's life that is meagerly paid, but is sustainable of a type, and to be able to continue creating into your 30s and 40s, even when you have kids, is so special. And then I feel good about social media and networked kind of publics and all this sort of stuff. And then I have a bad day, and I remember the pennies they get paid for their streams, certainly compared with what they would be paid for a mechanical sale for a radio play in the past, and I'm outraged, right? And yes, so it kind of just depends on what day you catch me in terms of
and what lens you're looking through.
Yeah. But just to throw out, because this is like slightly self-interested, but I have people in the room, we applied for a grant and we didn't get it, so I'm annoyed. But and so I'm going to have a little whinge about one thing about algorithms, which is that we know shockingly little about what Australian audiences do, right? So we know a lot about what these platforms will tell you because that's a lot of hype and it's in their interest. But we don't know a heap about what your average music listener, what your average TV watcher, your Netflix user, your ABC iView user, your person who wants to go and see a comedy show, your film fan, what they actually care about, how they make decisions about what they are going to then go and spend money on or consume or watch. And and I think that's like, and a very important part of the puzzle that we still need to kind of look at.
Very well said, and we're going to have to wrap it up there and hand over to the next panel. But will you join me, please, in thanking the authors of this book, Tony Moore, Mark Gibson, Chris McAuliffe and Maura Edmond. And now, please welcome to the stage my friend and colleague, the convener of the Centre of the Public Square at Per Capita, Director of Essential Media, who's going to take you through the really fun part of the evening, Peter Lewis.
Hi everyone. Before I go on, I spend a lot of my days working in politics, and so much of policy is icing and no cake, and this is the cake. The hard work of thinking through complex issues should not be taken lightly, and as a former minister, you'd know, Peter, so much you get is a thought bubble, and to have real substance underneath it is a real gift. So again, let's thank the authors. Terrific. So I'm kind of the fringe part of this event, and part of the idea of the public square is we've got to do the way we get together and discuss ideas, do it better. Part of that is not always starting with the point of conflict, so we just shout at each other, which those algorithms make us do. But the other part is, when we have an event like this, collapsing the stage a little bit. So it's not just the people up here and the audience, but how do we bring the audience into the conversation? And that's why we're going to ask you to pull out your phones, and if you can, anyone ever used a QR code? You remember during COVID? Hopefully you can get it from here, because I'm going to ask you as we go through the discussion with our panel to guide us and take us on where you want us to go with some of this discussion. So we're not just going to be talking at you, we're going to try to get you to talk with us. Is that all working? So if it works, you can just sort of stick the thumbs up. We've actually got 4 people in. Let's try to get a quorum just to make it fun. And while we're doing that, I'm going to invite our panel up. And what we've got is 3 people who were really some of the cultural leaders that inspired the authors in their work, and a number of them were figured in the book. Firstly, Courtney Gibson, who is Managing Director of C-Type, a strategic arts and screen consultancy with a vast background in commissioning docos, drama and comedy for the ABC. Hi Courtney, come up. Did you do your QR code? Are you in there? Excellent, it worked, great. Secondly, the founder of Bakehouse Studios, a key organiser and spokesperson for Save Live Music Australia, and as her age profile proclaimed, a passion for the rich culture of Melbourne's underbelly. Helen McAuliffe. Hey Helen. Thank you. Finally but not least, Paul Callaghan, who is the head of games and interactive at Vic Screen and a respected creator and activist in the independent games community, which is something I did not even know existed until I read Fringe to Famous. You can see I actually read it because I've made a few notes. So before we get started, the first thing I want people to tell us is, how do you feel about the future of Australia's fringe cultures at the moment? Is this an optimistic discussion, or are we all reflecting the former minister and with a bit of an ends of days feeling about where things are going at the moment? So we're dropping down 3.8, 3.7. So we'll bounce around there, but let us know how you're feeling, guys. And as that's coming out, let's ask you guys. So, Courtney, starting with you, are you largely optimistic about the capacity of the fringe in terms of the book's construct to keep feeding our cultural conversations, or have we put up barriers that are going to be insurmountable?
I think there are, you're always trying to remove the barriers to access. And I guess, the thing about the mainstream is it absolutely needs the fringe. Channel 7 needed the ABC to work with Kath and Kim so they could come and poach Kath and Kim. And then because they poached Kath and Kim, that left a whole lot of spectrum and ABC budget to bring in, the next wave of comedians at the time. So it's a kind of a not outside in thing. I think it's just a loop. And, people have to move from the fringe into the mainstream in order to make room behind them so that more people can come into the fringe. Yeah. So it's just this kind of continuous loop with lots of blurred lines. And I think there's another thing too, which I think Peter and others have alluded to, which is you can actually be in the mainstream and still actually be an activist and operate, I guess, in that kind of from a fringe position, but reach vast audiences. So that's, to me, has always been key, just trying to support people to reach as big an audience as possible.
So kids with ideas today who are maybe coming out of either a TAFE or a uni or just working it out for themselves, like, is there a way through for them?
I think that making sure there are pathways. No one walks out of TAFE or out of high school or uni ready to go onto a set or ready to do... It's that kind of the pathways between tertiary and training and you know, in the gig is sort of critical. Yeah, I think that's where that kind of, it's just the garden you have to keep maintaining and doing that work, building those pathways.
Yeah. Helen, you led the campaign for live music in Melbourne. Do you feel like you're pushing against a closed door or one that people want to keep open?
That's an interesting question. So in terms of live music in general, things have changed. They've changed a lot over the last 13 years. And I didn't want to come up here and be the pessimist right now.
No, that job was taken at the first speech. So
it was. Because there's things that I'm really excited about in terms of fringe culture and music culture. And something that Maura touched on was First Nations culture as well, and it's coming from all angles, and the education that we're having and the knowledge that is being passed down and that collective knowledge that we should have had a long time ago. What I'm very pessimistic about is, and I know you touched on, you didn't want to talk about precarity of artists in the book. However, if we're looking at music culture and artists, there are so many problems. Their access to housing, their long-term security, their ability to create art. And there was an article that came out, I think, in The Guardian recently that talked about music being made by only the rich and those who could afford it. So are we losing the working class stories or the struggles throughout this closed door that's happening because of that precarity and that lack of being able to survive within the industry? Looking at music industry, labels, the indie labels are shutting down. They're shutting down every day. Publishers are not signing any new artists at the moment. Any publisher I've spoken to are not signing new artists, and in the past they'd sign a whole lot of artists and they'd hope something will funnel through. They're relying on their heritage rosters and things that can be worked with sync, etc. We're seeing the demise and a huge attrition of artists post-COVID, and particularly women and GNC artists, because when they were the first people that had to respond to looking after their elderly parents, homeschooling, whatever happened to them throughout the pandemic, and the first thing that went was their art. So I don't want to be too dire because there could be a recalibration that's happening. So pubs, small venues, for years they have had, that was the incubator of live music. That's where people cut their teeth. But there's that marriage with alcohol as well. And the model isn't working, and it was an exploitative model where artists weren't paid properly as well. So how do we balance that and break that umbilical cord with alcohol sales, make it for all ages, all abilities, the access to music and art and culture? And I'm feeling this might be an outcome of the closure of venues. And Victoria, Melbourne used to talk about we're the live music capital because we have more venues than anyone. And I felt that was a bit of a false statistic. We were the live music capital because we had sophisticated audience, that it came from community radio, it came from the street press, it came from that grassroots. It wasn't just the volume of venues.
But it was also structural too. Like, I come from Sydney, and pokies killed live music in Sydney, and Melbourne hung on to it a lot better. I better move on to Paul.
Oh, please,
because
sorry,
I
I've
think
hogged the
and
time,
someone's
but-
going to tell me if we run out of time,
Please.
but we'll keep it going as long as people want. So tell us a bit about the independent games music and games movement or community, but also, Paul, what's your feeling about the future, positive or negative?
Well, potted history of video games. I mean, Australia's sort of really interesting, and this is covered in the book. Is this microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, great. It's sort of potted history. Like, Australia was built up around these kind of studio work for hire models in the sort of the early 2000s, and the GFC really sort of collapsed a lot of that activity because everyone was bidding for the same work. So when that work went away, a lot of those studios shut down. What emerged sort of off the back of that was this generation of developers who really thought, if I want to work in games, if I want this creative practice, I have to build my own. And so over the period of sort of 10, 15 years, that's what we've seen develop. And so the thing that is interesting to me is the pride that engenders when you've sort of come through this kind of crisis moment and built up companies, creative practice. You know, you feel a real ownership. It was interesting, mention of the cultural cringe. I'm obviously not from Australia originally, so I mean, Scotland has its own cultural cringe issues. But it's interesting when I work in games, because games is kind of operating in this globalized sphere, and the number of gatekeepers in terms of access to finance, in terms of access to audience, is very different. And that cultural cringe is very different. I've also been a writer and a sort of narrative designer and worked in other creative communities, and games embody a really interesting confidence within Australia that is quite distinctive, and that is really exciting to me. And I think having gone from being a sort of a strange activist running a festival to now being a policy person, being part of that continuity and finding ways within that environment to consciously create space for that without being gatekeepery, and also getting older and seeing that, having seen, egotistically going, I was right a decade ago, so it's possible that I'm right now, is really interesting. You end up creating the space for that next generation. And I think
I've heard it described as trying to build a thriving middle class rather than just having all these fireworks that become bigger than anything. And like my supposition was it was just a startup culture in gaming. So I think one of the reasons the guys really focused on gaming in the book was to give a sense that you can build things differently.
Yeah, and I think like it's because it's technology, people think of it as a technology industry, but it's moved into that kind of creative practice. And individuals, like one of the terms that I sort of used when I was working in the UK is the idea of the artist game maker, similar to artist filmmaker. It's people working in an artistic mode with the same tools, but outside of a heavily commercialized type of environment.
We've lost our
for me,
thing.
it's really exciting. I'm super optimistic.
Oh, Brody. Hope you're still there. We're about to ask people, because what's coming around the corner is AI-generated culture, right? How do we feel about that? How comfortable do we feel with AI-generated music? How comfortable are you with AI-generated scripted drama, games, jokes? ChatGPT wrote all my material tonight. Because what is really interesting is that we polled the broader public on some of these questions a few months ago with the Essential Report, which we do with The Guardian. In terms of music, 49% said they would be comfortable to listen to music generated by AI, including 59% of under 35s. 45% say they'd be comfortable reading novels, including 55% of under 35s if they read. Watching films and TV scripted by AI was 44%, 54% of under 35s, and we didn't ask about jokes. But Courtney, would you, if you got a script that was commissioned, would you commission a script you knew was developed by AI? Would you care if it was good? And would you know?
I don't know. I think I would know. I do a lot of kind of policy and report writing now, and occasionally I'll think, oh, fuck, I'll just get ChatGPT to write this bit for me. And I do it, and it's so overwritten and florid and camp and repetitive that I spend more time
on the one hand,
editing it
but on
than
the
I would
other.
have actually written it. My partner is Charlie Chan, who's a composer, and they have their own AI. So I live with this AI called Charlie AI, and it's interesting because it's around me all the time now. And Charlie has trained it to compose music the way they do, not just play the way they do, but actually to compose music, and
Write a political activist song in the style of Peter Garrett.
Oh yeah, that would
Easy.
They do that already, don't they? But, I guess I know producers are using AI a lot when they are, so you option a book, you've got to read the book, you've then got to write a treatment in order to send it into Vic Screen or wherever. And a lot of producers go, I just don't have time. And so ChatGPT writes the pitch, and then they get a quite usually disgruntled writer to come in and rewrite it at the last minute.
Which was actually what the Screen Guild strike in America was
right. So the
last year,
outcomes
right?
of that industrial action were really significant. The Writers Guild action and also the SAG-AFTRA, the actors' strike. So now what the upshot of that is that the writers are really controlling the AI. They can use it they can use it to write a script. It's not going to diminish their credential or anything like that. But the studios can't use it. It all has to be with the writers. So that was a really important action, as was what the actors' deal, which involved, making replicas of actors and then being able to use them in perpetuity. The thing I think is really important about AI and creativity is that it's really important that artists and creatives get ahead of it. I think instead of deciding that AI is the Antichrist and it's going to ruin us all, and the copyright thing is, a critical issue, but there's an extent to which it's much more important to be part of it and be driving it and be part of testing and challenging it. Otherwise, we're going to end up where we were with digital, where we were with streaming, where we are with music streaming content. It's like this is like the fifth wave of the impacts of technology and digital on the creative industries. And are we for a fifth time going to just kind of end up not being part of these discussions that are going on because we fear it or we don't approve of it? The point is to get in and be part of it and use it and drive it and have something to say about it and say it.
Do you agree, Helen, with music, or is it actually a form of cultural cancer that cannot be treated?
I actually agree. And in the terms of, if you think about songwriting, for example, we had the APRAs last week. So when the most performed banger pop song was awarded, you saw a number of writers that would come up. And I think the way it will be used, that some of those writers may lose their positions on that song, for example, because the driver of the creativity will use AI as a tool, saying, I need a particular beat or whatever, and they will be able to reference the content from all the content out there. So it'll be a useful tool in that sense, if it's used properly and we get ahead of it. But in live music, I think you had asked me about live music as well. Well, live music is about, we go there to watch humans fail. It's about the pursuit of human endeavour and watching people fall. And that's that experience that we want, and that collective experience. So AI might be used to produce the music, but I feel in the replication and what we're watching live will be a different experience. It will still be a human experience. I'm not afraid of it at this point. And also, it's not, they said, the camera, the photocopier, the synthesizer, the cassette would ruin art, and guess what? It hasn't. It's just been a tool.
I've been doing fascinating work with the Human Technology Institute, where we're talking to workers in lots of different industries, and people know where the lines should be drawn, and I think that's probably true with cultural producers as well. Paul, how's it being used in the gaming community?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting distinction, I think, which both Courtney and Helen touched on, which is around, it as a tool, and certainly for, asset production and ideas around that, it's it's been embedded for such a long time, and certainly large corporations are leveraging it that way. The larger question, because the sort of the idealized thing from a games perspective is the Star Trek holodeck. You go into this empty room and you say, I want an experience which is X, and it generates this kind of meaningful experience. And the thing that I think about with AI is that will audiences respond to that dream? I think when you look at some of the images or the shots that are generated, or even the sequences that are generated from AI, they're not complete experiences as we kind of experience them as audiences, and they're not complete experiences as we would construct them as artists. And so there is this point that I have the question around, if we reach that point where it's a complete experience, will it have that human touch? Will we see a person do that tightrope walk of failing? Will we feel a connection to another human being, or will people be able to sense the content of it? Is really the question that I have. It's as a tool for generation and support of an artist, I think there's a path there. But the real question I have is do we reach that holodeck moment? And I'm not sure either way yet.
Okay. We're almost at time, but I had one final question, which is, how do we keep our Fringe looking good? And if any of you want to, and look, there are 10 fantastic recommendations in this, but also I think the discussion about culture, and I think my learning from this book is you don't just think about culture as what's coming out of the centre, but also what are the inputs, and that notion of fluidity on the externals, and that some people live their life on the fringes, and that's totally fine as well, right? So I'm interested in the panel. Was there any one of the 10, or have you got something else to bring to the table that stood out as sort of being particularly important in terms of growing the Fringe? And start with you, Paul, because you've got a bit of Fringe left.
I was really struck by something that Maura said about the activist. Oh, was it not? No.
That's probably better. We were hearing it.
Is that better?
The worse? There we go.
There we go.
Oh, it wasn't on one. Yeah, cool, great. When activists move into policy, and I think what that does within the structure, like for games specifically, Screen Australia have an Emerging Game Makers Fund. Screen New South Wales have a similar fund, and Vic Screen has a similar fund as well. And that emerges from the types of people doing that sort of policy work. But some of that I think you can only emerge when you've done that other type of practice along the way. So the way that the mainstream brings those people in, and it comes in, because I've tried to be an artist and I'm not an artist. I've realized that, but I at least took the swing, and I've got 3 terrible novels that no one will ever read. So I know that I'm not an artist, but what I am really good at is I'm a producer and an editor and a policymaker, and I'm committed to, and I'm also an educator in some way. So that bringing those things to bear within a policy framework, within a space where you can support people, where you can design systems that create the spaces for those new generations, and you can embed them institutionally. I think that to me is a big part of what creates the Fringe, and building the infrastructure. And I'm not a massive fan of the word ecosystem, but where you're able to build the different parts and empower different people who want different types of lives that include different relationships to art and the mainstream. I think that's kind of the thing that is important, and it requires vision and leadership and all of that stuff together.
Apart from the geopolitics, the other thing coming through is universal basic income, more money, which is an interesting part of it, in particular to Maura's points earlier. Helen, anything that stood out for you in the recommendations?
It was
that
interesting.
You want to lean into?
Yeah, the first recommendation around sheltered spaces. I'm not a fan of that word, to be honest, but I think that was referring to those community-based spaces where ideas would flourish. And from my own experience at Bakehouse, a recent government intervention we had was some funding towards disability access. Now, this was an election commitment, it was a popular choice, but it was very unusual for a government to go in and retrofit an artist-run space, a for-profit space, for disability access. But one thing that we do in order to, we kind of do a sheltered program, let's say. So we've identified certain areas over the last 30 years, and we've made particular decisions around supporting historically underrepresented communities. So For years, we've run a First Nations fellowship and residency. We partner with the Archie Roach Foundation to provide free space without any intervention from us. So we're not involved in the creative programming at all. We run a women's bursary and gender diverse bursary. We put 86 artists through last year. We are about to offer a disability residency, for example. So running this sort of social programming where ideas can be developed and we can facilitate it without having to get involved is important, but it needs support. Because financially, for businesses like ours, and we deal very much with the top end and the mainstream and the fringe of music, everything from artists doing their first ever rehearsal, school kids, right up to maybe the midnight oils of this world. So, and everything in between. So to be financially viable and to be able to offer that arm of sheltered programming.
Which is really a test of how we value our culture, right? We better one up. Courtney, finally, if we were to make you our cultural czar or czarina, which of those would you be running with first?
I would be looking at decolonising, commissioning, curatorial, all of those processes. And because there's a danger, I think, always where you've got an interesting fringe or where it's a fine line between opening up an industry and giving access and making it a lot more inclusive on the one hand and welcoming everybody into the mainstream and or on the other hand, creating this second tier where where everybody who isn't part of, the monoculture, for want of a better word, is in this perpetual fringe, perpetually getting attachments, mentorships, bursaries, subsidies, tick, tick, tick. We're doing all of our good CSR compliance stuff. But actually, we're still keeping all the primetime slots. We're keeping all the big budgets for the mainstream. The mainstream, as soon as, people from underrepresented groups start getting in, the mainstream sort of starts to become entrenching the kind of the gates around it. And then what happens is the fringe doesn't move into the mainstream. No one can get into the fringe. So the fringe says, oh, fuck it, let's go over to TikTok. So, and then, and then in the end, the mainstream audiences say, it's really boring here now, so maybe we should start watching TikTok, and everything gets kind of out of
TikTok, from
whack.
TikTok to Australian Idol, that can be the follow-up book, maybe. That's
No, it's like real meaningful inclusivity with removing all barriers to access.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for your contributions. Thanks for contributing in, guys. I'm going to get Emma to wrap it up. If you're interested in the work of the Public Square, there's some flyers out the front. We do a fortnightly podcast, who doesn't, called Burning Platforms. And thanks for being part of it, guys. I don't know if you'd like to wander off or just stay here while Emma does her thank you.
Well, let's thank Peter, Courtney, Helen and Paul for that fantastic discussion. Thank you to the authors, to Tony, Mark, Maura and Chris. Thank you to our sponsors tonight, Morris Blackburn, Michael Cooney's here. Thank you very much for your generous support of this event and many other per capita events. And thank you, Peter Garrett, for making yourself available here tonight. I share some of your concerns, but relentless optimism is what Susan Ryan used to tell me. Relentless optimism is needed in public life, and that goes for the arts. The arts and culture are critically important, particularly in this time where we're seeing increasing levels of polarisation in society, of fracturing of our society, because the arts is how we build empathy, it's how we tell each other stories, and it's how we understand what it means to be a human being. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We do have some post-event refreshments. It wouldn't be an arts event if we kicked you out without another drink, so please join us in the foyer. And you can follow us online at percapita.org.au at the centre of the Public Square, and congratulations to all of the authors on a fantastic publication. Good night.